Hello, everyone. Welcome to a Street Entrepreneurs Workshop. Today we have Jay Murray with us today, who's going to talk to us about from manufacturer to user, finding and communicating your value to a myriad of stakeholders. Jay is joining us from Pittsburgh. How are things in Pittsburgh today?
Quite well. I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. So I'm going to go ahead and share your PowerPoint.
Okay.
And you can take it away. If you are watching from home, feel free to submit your questions either via the Facebook Messenger, LinkedIn, Twitter, or Instagram. And we will select some of them and pass them on to Jay at the end of the session.
Perfect. So today's talk workshop is called From Manufacturer to User first, and I want to a little bit broaden that. So I will talk about the entire value chain going from the concept. If you're at the concept stage, if you have nothing more than a couple of folks who have an idea and want to implement that idea, all the way to then your user. So even beyond your customer, if your customer is not your user, going to that user, and then perhaps after sales maintenance and how you start bringing in those folks and providing value to them as well with whatever you're creating and the team that you're creating. As far as finding and communicating value, and specifically stakeholders, there's a lot around customer discovery. Who is your customer? How do you provide value to your customer, but broadening that to all of your stakeholders along that chain in moving your product from idea to user and beyond, and finding that value, communicating that value, determining what that value is to each of those people along those stops, quantifying that value, and identifying the right people to talk about that value too. So perhaps you're having challenges at determining who within a large organization is right for you to speak with, or how that person changes based upon which organization you're talking to. And hopefully we'll be able to go into that today. I don't think this will take the whole hour. So like Juliana said, we will have some time at the end for questions. And I've requested that if there's any pervasive questions that come up multiple times while I'm speaking, that we can just hop right into those questions and get them out of the way so I can address any concerns right then. I've listed some potential players right here on the screen initially. They might not be right for you. They might not be the same people who are in your value chain. I hope today to talk about the process and the tools to get there, but know that the couple cases that I'll talk about today, both my company and another company called EverCharge, that for you it might not necessarily be the same, but hopefully it'll give you the tools to get there for you. All right. Like Juliana said, I'm Jay Murray. I have a couple of hats right now. I'm program manager at Idea Foundry, so that's where I currently am. We are a nonprofit economic development organization, so a 501c3 in Pittsburgh. We serve the southwestern Pennsylvania area and create jobs through investment in very early stage startups. Initially, that was looking at particularly what academics were doing. So we're housed right between Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh, if you're familiar. And there is a lot of federal money, a lot of state money, a lot of taxpayer dollars that go into creating new innovations on the cutting edge, the cusp, and how do we extricate those from the labs, take that intellectual property, determine who the stakeholders are, what value is there, and hopefully successfully commercialize that and provide a little bit of investment along the way. Since our founding 18 years ago with that, we have moved more broadly into helping many entrepreneurs in the southwestern Pennsylvania area, but my focus is still on what we call a program here is called Impact Innovations, and we have two levels. It's the accelerator program and then the fellowship level. Accelerators usually, we're helping form those companies, and the fellowship level is maybe 2-3 years later when there's some traction, but maybe a realignment needs to happen. They're not quite at the Series A level. And that's where I focus my efforts day to day. I'm also CEO of Solinius. Solinius started as an idea in 2015. In 2017, we actually founded the company. And I'll go into quite a bit of detail about what Solinius is, what we do, who we sell to, and what those stops along those value chain look like. So I won't spend too much time on that right now. And then my background is engineering. It's not what I do day to day. I work with engineers and I have engineers that work for me, but it's more of a technical skill set that I've learned to apply to what I do now. I never really looked at my engineering degree, and I hope if there's anybody who's super technical who's listening to this today, doesn't mean you need to go into engineering. There's plenty of things outside of engineering where you can use those critical thinking skill sets, and that's really what I looked at my degree as, which is just a degree in critical thinking. It's a little known sect of mechanical engineering called engineering science, which is just a little bit more broad. So is this talk right for you today? And I might have gone into this a little bit sooner, but just because it's listed here doesn't mean it's wrong. This is just who it's most targeted to. My background is in hardware and technology-focused products, whether that's energy and Internet of Things and data transfer, medical products, things of that nature. More complex sales models, so typically not business to business or direct to consumer, but adding additional levels into that. Are you using a distributor model? Are you licensing your technology, but also providing design services? Or as Solinius uses, which is a B2B2C model. And if we talk about Evercharge at the end, that's even a little bit more complicated and kind of changes based upon who or what segment of the market they're selling into. And as far as timing of your company, I get the sense many people here are most likely earlier in their startup stages in their life cycle. As am I. Solinius is more of a lifestyle company. It's less of a venture track, and that's where I focus much of my efforts and kind of pushing entrepreneurs into more of a, create this sustainable business model. And then if you want the venture money will follow. But if you are a venture track, if you're pre-Series A, this would be the right time for you and the equivalent for a lifestyle company. So value. What is value, first of all? We can define it extremely broadly as it doesn't have to be money. It could be providing risk reduction. It could be providing additional service. It could be providing relationships. If you are taking anything off the table that they have to push resources and assets towards to cover that section of their business, if you're able to reduce that for them in any way, I would say that's providing value. Defining stakeholders. So in this process of going from finding value to getting it out the door, defining stakeholders and finding value is going to be a very iterative process. Many times, like I said earlier, this is talk of customer discovery and a focus on who's the customer, who's paying for it. And I wouldn't argue that that is not important. They're the ones who's going to be providing you with capital, but broadening that to defining your stakeholders. And what the value is to those particular stakeholders is going to change. And just like you do customer discovery interviews, I would say there are stakeholder discovery interviews that need to be done. And I would always caution, and as I do to the companies that come into Idea Foundry, there has been this push towards do as many customer discovery interviews as you can and get them out of the way quickly. I would say it's an ongoing process. As you continue to develop, continue to engage your stakeholders, continue to engage your customers, and be prepared. So have an idea before you go into it, having done your homework, knowing what they might get out of it. So when you walk in that door, when you're trying to get that meeting, you already have an idea of what value you might be giving to them. And in that sense, and many times if you're selling B2B or you're using another distributor network, these individuals, their time is very limited. So you have a very good idea going into it that you're not wasting their time and you're going to be able to continue developing that relationship afterwards, especially if the hope is to eventually sell them. You want to make sure that you can get that next email, that next meeting with them. After you've gone through that iterative process of aligning that value with all the stakeholders in that value chain, which we'll talk about, I believe, next. How do you communicate that value? And it's going to be different for each person along that chain. And many times, typically, money talks. So in logistics, that communication of value is kind of flipped. They're the ones who are providing you a service, even if you are, they're integral to how you end up getting your product to the customer. And then many other times, like I said, risk reduction. When we talk about Solinius, we have kind of a co-sale model where we are at risk with the distributor simultaneously while they're selling their product to the final customer. And then, like any lean model, you're refining and you're updating as you're going through this process. Just some of the steps along that journey from concept to delivering it to your final user and making sure that your final user is able to continue using it with after-sales service. These bits and pieces are going to change for you, but many times at the concept level, the resources and stakeholders you need are usually your team. Who's on your team? What critical resources do they have, typically intellectually, but potentially also relationships? Are you working within a university setting? If you're working within a university setting, then you have all this additional potentially bureaucracy you have to deal with, but you also have the network of the university and the resources that come with that. If you are a single founder, it might be particularly easy to do this because you know what you have. However, as you get towards design and licensing, if that's going to be within your model, identifying what you don't have and what stakeholders you will need to bring into the equation as things go on. Formation, so that's taking that jump from concept, building your team, and I would always now it's a little bit more difficult with COVID, but networking and finding the right people for your team. There is an author, Antonio Garcia Martinez, who wrote a book called Chaos Monkeys, and he says a startup has two miracles, and one of those miracles is always making sure that the team functions appropriately. So you get one additional miracle, and going to those networking events, building those friendships with potential founders is always going to be very important. And making that jump to formation is you're making a commitment that you guys are going to be there, or gals are going to be there for quite a while in trying to reach this goal that you've set for yourself. Through to design. So then making the decision, are we going to be doing this in-house, or are we going to pull in outside stakeholders? Are we licensing this design from somebody else? Does that design need to be iterated upon within the organization? Once it's out to customers, are you going to be able to support it internally, or do you have to bring in somebody else? This is one where, being in Pittsburgh, I'm a big proponent of finding local firms rather than outsourcing. Outsourcing is a great way to find cheap, particularly quick turn on development of whether it's an app, whether it's a physical product. But many times there's not that ingrained relationship, whether it's geographic or shared backgrounds, shared experiences, being able to walk over to their shop, my background being hardware, and seeing what it is they're doing at any given time and iterating upon that quickly. And many times at this stage of life, you don't quite have the capital. So finding those team members who are willing to take the jump, the value to them typically at this point is equity, putting in sweat equity, determining what that vesting schedule is going to look like, how much they might be paid down the road. What is the goal? Is it to exit in 5 to 7 years, or are you going to try to turn this into a lifestyle business? Licensing. So especially in the university world, which I've worked in now for 2 years, there are these big corporate behemoths that have to be worked with to make sure that invention disclosures are filed, make sure that all of the proper channels have been gone through to properly extricate that federally funded intellectual property and put it into the organization. And based upon which university you may or may not work for, there are different methods for doing that. It might be an option, which means that you have to have particular resources behind you, or it might be an outright license right off the bat for a particular amount of time, and you're negotiating that the university or whomever you might be licensing from is supporting the intellectual property behind that. So if there's any office actions with the U.S. Patent Office or internationally through WIPO, that's handled with outside resources, and that you don't have to divert the limited capital that your company has to make sure that all of that is done properly. And then on to manufacturing. So you've got a design, you're ready to get it out the door. And all of this is taking into account that you've done that customer discovery, you know what the user wants. And perhaps this is just a prototyping stage. This is the one where it gets very difficult to do locally, unfortunately, especially in my realm, because of the cost and the technicalities behind the large equipment that's involved. So for Solinius, it's PCB manufacturing and assembly. For your company, it could be injection molding. It could be testing and calibration. It could be anything along the realm of the physical. Could be concrete based. But that's where you can start to build these more less cash intensive relationships, especially at the very early stages. Many of these manufacturers know that there's always a potential, the same way that AWS might give you credits, that one of these startups that they're working with is going to turn into a big whale one day. So they are willing to go on a limb many times and say, we'll cover or subsidize that prototyping expense for you, or any capital paid in right now will go towards later production batches. And that's a good way to get your foot in the door. What they're looking for is consistency, building those relationships. Many times they have individuals who are assigned to you, so you can build a personal relationship. And many times I've found with the manufacturing side of things, those relationships are going to stay around a while. Whereas with logistics, the next one, it's very common for the individual that you're working with at one of these third-party logistics companies, otherwise known as 3PLs, turn over very quickly. I think we use DHL for some of our business, and maybe in the last 2 years, we've had 3 or 4 different representatives. For my company and for Solinius, we have a little bit of an issue is because we sell into very remote communities in sub-Saharan Africa, East Africa in particular, for the product that I'm going to talk about today. And there's only so many ways for us to get it to the final customer. So we have to determine who's the right partner for us based upon what they currently offer. And for us, that was DHL. But even then, they can only get it 97% of the way. And then we need to rely on those local relationships that either DHL can connect us to, or that we're able to find ourselves or through our distributor network to get it the last couple miles. Or perhaps build that into our distributor network where they are the ones doing those installations. As far as regulatory, this will change vastly for you, for in particular medical devices or anything of that nature. Of course, there's years worth of work, as we know, and have been exposed to constantly in the last 8 to 12 months regarding 8 to 10 months regarding COVID. There's a lot of hurdles to go through. It typically takes years, and there are firms out there that can help you with that. As far as stakeholders for Solinius, a little closer to home, you might be working with Underwriters Laboratory, otherwise known as UL. If you are exporting your product, which is most relevant to me, there are customs processes that you have to go through. Now, sometimes your logistics providers can help you with that, but sometimes they can't, especially if you need to design your particular product to a specification. Again, going back to the design and finding somebody who's familiar with what you're doing. For us, it's UNBS or the National Bureau of Standards for Uganda. And again, it'll change for you. Sales, again, this is where you can get creative. Your customer can become your sales network. As far as Solinius is concerned, that's the case. And starting to divide the risk between the two. They're not always looking for capital compensation or cash compensation. Maybe they're looking to broaden their network of existing sales, or take their risk off the plate, or just provide them with an additional service where you add value and it provides you with all these opportunities for additional sales. Customer, I'm not going to particularly touch because we'll get into that next. User is the same, and then after sales. So perhaps, especially with physical products, how do you make sure that that product works beyond installation? Making sure that for any warranty coverage that you might provide or aspire to provide, you have a network in place to handle all of that. And perhaps find another avenue for additional sales after you've moved that core product. Especially in software, it's very common where you have a core product and you have all kinds of additional widgets. That's a good place to provide insight to the customer about that. This is just a template, excuse me, that I whipped up detailing all of these different stops that you might or might not make along the chain of getting your product to your customer. And if this is something that works for you, I would say I hope this, I don't know if this will be available afterwards, but for sure, use this, fill this in yourself, and look at how it corresponds to your organization. So hopping into Solinius. So a little background on Solinius. We are a public benefit corporation, which means that we have more than just a fiduciary duty to our shareholders. We have it written into the company bylaws that our board of directors looks at more than just the bottom line. Our bottom line consists of making sure that we are providing value to our customers, providing value to our distributors, and everybody along that value chain. We're treating our people correctly, our employees correctly. We are making sure that we are minimizing our impact on the planet. And in the case of our product, it's kind of inherent. And then as well as making sure that we do provide return to our investors, even though we don't have any outside equity holders, making sure that if they were to come in, we're focusing on that. We develop what is in essence a black box that we sell through a distributor network in East Africa. So East Africa being Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and depending on who you speak with, South Sudan. However, we focus all of our efforts in Uganda for now, and we have a couple other products that are sold elsewhere. We allow existing last mile solar distributors to securely finance their existing product set. So by supplementing their existing panels, their batteries, their supply chain that they have already developed, they know where they're getting their stuff from. We provide this additional piece of hardware which allows them to plug into and make sure that instead of using a rudimentary form of financing where they're kind of just pestering their customers, hey, you owe me a payment, hey, you owe me a payment, we can codify that. We can put that into writing essentially and enforce it. Just like you or I here would pay for our electricity or our water or any other critical infrastructure, we make sure that we have a system in place to make sure that their customers pay them. And in that sense, they're able to decrease the barriers to entry for individuals in these locales to provide solar to their homes. And that means that for these distributors, they're able to broaden their base of whom they're selling to. There is an added cost, but many times that added cost is just pushed to the final customer. And Solinius is at risk for some of it. So it becomes a bit of a challenge as far as cash flow is concerned. But making sure that we always have our pulse on the market and other competitors which are coming in. And that's another point. What your chain looks like, especially in hardware, where you could be outsmarted within 18 months and somebody else could come into the market and absolutely be highly capitalized and push you out. This will change based upon those market factors primarily. So let's take a minute. We can go across each of these bits: design, production, logistics, sales, customer, user, and after sales, and how we at Solinius handle them. And then after that, we'll go into EverCharge. And I specifically picked EverCharge because it was something that I did during my time at University of Pittsburgh during a senior design course. This was quite a few years ago at this point. But it was something that we were considering for Solinius, and like I talked about, being pushed out of the market by a highly capitalized competitor. EverCharge could do that, and there are a number of other players, including like Electrify America that was spun out of VW. For design, we do all of our design in-house. The value for us is that we are reducing our costs. We have the team capabilities. However, we need to make sure that because we're a small team, I don't lose any of my team members. So going back to that triple bottom line, making sure that I treat them fairly. And anytime you're creating a culture within your organization, it's up to you to determine what's important to you and what's important to the people that you want to employ. And kind of there's this idea of creating a customer archetype, but what does your employee archetype look like? And making sure that they resonate with your culture. They're going to broaden your culture, make sure that you're not shooing yourself into a particular mindset. You want to be challenged. Make sure you have all these different ideas, but making sure that everybody's going to be happy as well, because that's going to be most beneficial and providing benefit to your end customer. As far as responsibilities for us, we're looking at the hardware design, testing, and calibration processes. Our needs is that we need reliability. We need to meet all those other stakeholder needs. So when I'm building a team, making sure that people I bring onto my team can meet those needs. The solution is finding that good team. The value add to us, the benefit and the value add are the same here because it's one party, and then the regulatory, which I talked about previously. As far as production, you'll have multiple partners and they'll change. For us, it's many partners at this point, and it would change as we scale our output. But we made sure we found partners which could grow with us, which recognized the value outside of just that early capital, who made sure that they knew we were small. We weren't going to be able to provide them with huge orders up front. And in return, we are not on a time crunch for providing product to our customer. So our value to them is that we can give them long lead times. If they do, in fact, have a quick turn, that's even better, but we're very flexible in providing that. And many manufacturers are looking for that flexibility and how they can fit you in. And many times they'll compensate you for that, and that you will get a cost reduction. So for PCBs, for example, industry standard for small order sizes are like 4 or 5 days. If we tell them 3 weeks or 4 weeks before we need something because we're planning that far ahead, that's very valuable. And regulatory, lead levels, worker conditions. So if you are doing production offshore, making sure that the worker conditions are what they need to be. I have some background in textile manufacturing, and that's huge for H&M and Zara and these other fast fashion companies. And there are third-party organizations out there like WRAP, like BCI, like Cotton from Africa, that will come in and do these audits, or even Intertech, these large firms, and make sure that things like that are being met. Logistics, it's primarily a financial compensation transaction. And the benefit to us is that they can start to handle some of those customs and get our product from here to there easily, and there being Uganda. Now, where it becomes interesting for us in particular is within the sales, customer, user segment, and where things start to get blurry, where our customer is both the distributor and the end user, but not always. So we would provide hardware to those distributors at a reduced cost. They typically are paying us 50% of what it would cost to an end user up front, and then we're at risk with them during the financing period for that end user. And that was something that we just found through working with them, that they didn't quite have the financial wherewithal to put all of that capital up front for our product. And that they wanted to make sure, because our product is connected, it's smart, we're able to speak with it remotely, that they didn't quite have the trust with us yet to make sure that we were going to continue that relationship beyond just offloading hardware to them and them paying us, because that's something that has happened in the past quite frequently, unfortunately. So that's somewhere we had to, is very much a give and a take relationship, and making sure that we're finding that value to them. It's not necessarily monetary. It's very much in a risk reduction capacity. As far as customer, again, that is both the distributor and the user. So for those distributors, there's one set of value, there's one way of communicating with them. In Uganda, we need to speak with both the managing director of our distributors and the technical director. Typically, those skill sets don't cross over, and that was something that we learned later than we should have, but just by being there. Very much speaking with our distributors and going through that process. And making sure that, my background is technical, my team's background is technical, making sure that we've prepared the right materials, the right marketing collateral for both of those parties, the technical side of things. And again, not making it too technical. We do have some time constraints. We don't want to sit there for 3 hours and try to explain this. And on the distributor, the managing director side, they're primarily looking at that risk reduction. They don't care that we're providing data each way and that they can log on and look at what's going on in real time. They want to know that they can broaden their market and that we're at risk with them and that we're going to be a partner with them in that sales process. And then users, we don't typically interact much with. That's something that we give to the distributor, but ultimately is what the end product is being used for, making sure that it is reliable, it is providing power to them when they pay, and learning the processes of credit and how credit is understood in those particular markets and how it changes between those markets. And many times it's a shifting landscape in Uganda, particularly because of the rise of mobile money. And that's just something that you have to understand when going into a new segment that you might not be familiar with. I wasn't particularly familiar with financing in Uganda, is just educating yourself as much as possible and knowing that it's a shifting landscaping, talking to people who are familiar with it. And then after sales for us, it's particularly going back to those distributors. The way that we've built our product, we wanted to make sure that the customer could grow as their lifestyle changed. So they pay off one particular kit, or they've gained enough credit and reliability and trust with both us and the distributor to say, hey, we want to upgrade. And we go back again and we tell these distributors, hey, we think their credit is good enough. They're using this much power per day. We suggest maybe another battery, maybe another panel is right for them, or they can tolerate an additional load. So whether that's a light or a radio or a television. And that's just one additional set of value, which spans both that a distributor and the final user. And then case two. So EverCharge, they have a particular product which they focus on condos and housing units. It is an electric vehicle charging station which can optimize the charge going to a particular car at a particular time based upon a whole host of factors. And those factors span from all of the potential stakeholders within that end user network that they've focused in on, which is those condos. However, they could start to go elsewhere. So essentially, they are able to install these electric vehicle chargers. The infrastructure necessary for electric vehicle chargers is very hefty. The power supply is high. So you need to make sure that the power coming out doesn't exceed those limitations. So if you're smart about it, you know what vehicles are there, you know what the vehicle charge rates are, what the battery capacity, how many miles you're delivering in electric charge those cars are. You can optimize it in such a way where you decrease the infrastructure necessary. And that's really valuable to especially existing condos or existing apartment buildings or hospitals or parking garages or universities, because they don't have to then go back in and install new transformers, new power lines, which are much beefier, much larger. And for them, it's a huge cost savings. And in effect, we had looked at this a couple of years ago, and Evercharge, they have focused in on condos in particular. So they are looking at working with the homeowners associations, the car owners who are typically residents, as well as the building owners, and potentially even the individual who manages the building. So it's not always the same person who manages those rentals and the people coming in and out on a daily basis, and the person or the what's called a REIT or real estate investment trust, which might own the building. And you've got all these different players you need to speak with and make sure that your values align all the way across. So for maybe that REIT, you're saying, we're increasing the value of your building because you have this additional electric vehicle charging. Electric vehicle charging typically commands, or the individuals who own electric vehicles are typically more wealthy. They're typically younger, and their propensity to spend is higher. So that's more valuable for you as a REIT to bring in these higher paying customers. As a building owner, it's easier for you to sell to these customers. And one of the overarching themes here is that customer archetype. So who is your customer? Many times companies will put a name to it. So they'll fully describe an individual, an entirely imaginary individual. They'll give him or her a name. We worked with a company a while ago. We called her Stephanie, and she was a particular age. She lived in a particular area of the city. She had particular habits. She made a particular amount of money, or she was within a particular sector of employment. And that was the person who was most likely to spend money on your product. And in this sense, you can do the same. They're typically mid-30s. They are people who are environmentally conscious. So they're most likely left-leaning, which means that you're most likely going to be in an urban area. They are higher income. You've got all these different factors. And then aligning that with the buildings or with the REITs, with the operators that you're speaking with. And then there's that added sense of there's typically a homeowners association, which are overly bureaucratic, and there's a whole nother fish to fry. And then the question comes up is, okay, who am I supposed to be selling to here? Do I go to the REITs? Do I go to the operator of the building? Do I go to the individuals who rent the condos out directly? Do I go to that HOA? What are the processes? How do they change by each building, or is it geographically? And even though I'm delivering value to everybody along the chain, it might be more sustainable for me to pick one and go with it. And in the case of Evercharge, they actually go directly to those end customers. So they provide all kinds of marketing collateral, which they then are able to give to electric vehicle owners who live in condos and in the areas that they target. And they can bring it to their HOA. And then the HOA is the one who makes the decision to, okay, should we bring this to the building operator? And essentially, it is going to be the HOA's decision, because for that limited installation cost, it's going to come out of HOA dues. So they're the ones who are typically making a preliminary decision, and then maybe it's rubber stamped by everybody else. In the case of apartment buildings, maybe you don't have an HOA, so you go to the operator, go to the REIT. I believe EverCharge again goes through those renters who then they have marketing collateral specifically developed for the operators of the building. And then you need to identify, all right, who's the right person I'm speaking with at the REIT? Who is the right person at the HOA, at the building operator? And many times for EverCharge, it's the operators, it is the people who are in operations and might be involved with maintenance, the people who are day-to-day might interact with that parking, with the ability to move cars in and out, making sure that the building's industrial systems and infrastructure are operating the way that they're supposed to. As far as logistics for EverCharge, they need to identify credible partners in each of the locales that they're working with, and this is where it becomes difficult to scale, that have the necessary getting abilities to install infrastructure like this, because you're moving electricity around. For every municipality, it's going to be a little bit different, making sure that your electrician is chartered or has necessary licenses to go in and do these things. And then after sales, is it you who's doing it? Or are you able to get enough value out of it, or do you offload it onto somebody else? And then regulatory, like I said, those permits. I'm not privy to how they designed or produce their product, but I know from my background, it's difficult with electric vehicles right now because there are so many different ways in which you're interfacing with your product or the end customer. So there's what's called CSS or J1772. Tesla has a different one, and making sure that you either have a way to adapt your product, and as it goes for everything, adapt your product to that particular end user, or are focusing on one segment of the market which is sustainable for you. And for EverCharge, that means going with a J1772, which is the most prevalent, but also making sure that if necessary, if everybody in the building owns a Tesla or something, that you have the necessary adapters to do so. And that about does it. I would say if you have any questions beyond today, if you're not comfortable asking them in this forum, feel free to absolutely send me an email and I'll be happy to get back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jay, for that
Thank you.
wonderful presentation. I appreciate you. So I am trying to pick questions, but let me start from the top. So I know product iteration is an ongoing process, but how much should I iterate prior to launch?
Right. I'll talk about common methodology and maybe how we did it and the learnings that I took from that. So the common thought is, and maybe it's misinterpreted, is don't iterate. Get it out as fast as possible prior to maybe a significant launch. Get it in the hands of your customers as soon as possible. For us, that wasn't quite an option. We had to do quite a bit of iteration with local testing because the standards of what is a minimally viable product change for when we're working in Uganda. They expect it to work. And there's, I'll draw it very quickly, kind of a misconception about what a minimum viable product looks like, in that, if your product is a triangle and each of these are different levels of functionality, you don't want to give them this small base layer. You instead want to kind of give them a taste of everything. So you instead are along this tall axis here, and making sure that you have a little bit of everything, and that what's really critical is that it all works. Bugs are not a customer's friend, and their tolerance for that, especially it'll vary by market, and that's something you kind of need to suss out. Their to take that. If they're a large corporate and they're implementing this across a couple different areas, they don't want to have to go back to you all the time. They just kind of want it to work. So making sure that your deployments are low risk and you can kind of balance that, how much does it work versus not. So my particular, I give you the engineering answer, which is it depends. Speak with your customers. How risk averse are they, and something potentially not working exactly like you thought it might. And if they are able to do that, then I would say get it out the door quickly. Do less internal testing and get it in their hands versus the other way around, and making sure that you iterate a number of times internally to make sure you have a product which is maybe limited, but 100% working.
Awesome. And here's another question. So how do commercial product launches differ from research in the academic world?
Okay. Wow. That's I'm sure there are books written about that. Academic world. Many times I've seen a disconnect between many times. Okay. So in the academic world, you're solving a problem, but not necessarily a commercially sustainable problem. This might be something that afflicts a number of people that might not sustain a business, but is still a very real problem. And there's funding available to solve that problem. But that doesn't mean you can create a business out of it. There is also a longevity to research that happens academically, and that going down a particular rabbit hole, you might spend 10 to 15 years of your life academically looking at a particular problem while the world has gone a different route. And it's good to, as a society, we're hedging our bets against what might have been deployed commercially, and we have this other option in the wings, so to speak. But there's not always this sense of we need to turn around and sell it. Even with small business innovation research grants or STTR grants, tech transfer grants from the SBA, there is this sense of we are grading your application based upon your ability to, in the end, deploy this to a much broader audience. But that's not always how it ends up. Many times SBIR grants are on the back end. First, maybe you're funded by NSF and they're not even looking at commercial viability. So there's just this, many times, not always, a mismatch between developing something that's beneficial for humankind versus something that can be sold to a lot of people for quite a bit of money and make a sustainable business. And that's kind of where Solinius kind of crosses, and many benefit corporations cross those two things, as we wanted to create something that was beneficial for society and also viable from a business perspective.
Yeah, sustainable.
Correct.
Yeah. Wow, I could ask so many more questions about that, but let me table those for now and ask you. So, how does the product iteration process vary from products like food products and handmade items?
Well, okay. Food products. So I don't have much background in finished food products, but Idea Foundry has some backgrounds in working in agriculture with farms and getting products to the customers. So we worked last year with a co-op of something like 33 farms that needed to move their product from just north of here to customers in the Pittsburgh area and restaurants in the Pittsburgh area. That one was a more a business that had been around for quite a while and was kind of looking to pivot with all these different business models and delivery services of fresh, sustainable, organically grown produce became very difficult. How does the iteration process differ? Working with large businesses, I'd say the number of individuals you're going to be able to speak with is going to be limited. B2B models, B2B2C models are harder and that getting feedback is most likely going to take longer. It is most likely going to make or break. There's less leniency in all of how it goes. Whereas when you're working with consumers, consumer packaged goods or handmade goods, typically the cost to buy in, the price point at which your customers become part of the family, so to speak, they're buying your product is lower. And you have a much broader audience in which you're able to solicit that feedback from. So much so in that maybe it might be too big, it might be overwhelming. And that's where, again, becomes important to create that customer archetype. Who is the most important customer to you from a business perspective, and taking that feedback with a different weighting than you might from a business. If a business is going to be, some companies can sustain themselves on one contract with a large business, and the feedback you get from that one business is going to drive all of your decision making. Whereas if you have a consumer packaged good or a handmade good that you're selling just at local markets, you have so much different feedback. You need to determine what's important to you, what is important for the future of the business, and what you think is most sustainable. And as many people, and now it's a little more difficult, especially, but there are still digital platforms for soliciting feedback on these things. What do customers most want to see, and then what also resonates with you. There's always that you're the most important part of the team, as all of your employees are a very important part of your team, making sure that that direction still resonates with you and resonates with your mission. So that's how I would say it differs a little bit, knowing who to listen to.
Awesome. Thank you, Jay. And just a couple more questions.
Sure.
So I want to contextualize this for someone who's watching live, and they asked a question. So I have plans to manufacturing a computer case. What should be the very first thing I do in order to start manufacturing it? Is it making a prototype, raising capital, casual interviews with friends and family, making connections, or something else? So I was thinking we could, one, start by mapping out stakeholders for this individual, and then guide them through a plan, right? So some potential first steps they could take.
So I'm going to go into this thinking you already have done a little bit of market research. You know why you want to create this. You've seen a potential need for this.
So I have a little bit of background on this person's product, right? So the idea is you're looking down at your computer the whole day, right? And most people are not going to carry a monitor with them in their backpack, because then that creates another ergonomic problem, right? Your shoulders. So they have all sorts of like origami tray tables to lift computers, but then your hands are like this, right? So really, computers are not truly ergonomic, right? So this is designed for a Surface computer, and it allows you to do something like this, right? So you open it and you lift it, right? So the keyboard stays down below and the screen goes up. So that's the concept. How they're going to engineer that and bring it to fruition is yet another another thing. So this person has an idea that they see a need for, right? And I mean, our generation has visible humpbacks. That's a very clear need statement, problem statement, right? They have thought of a solution, which they've prototyped on cardboard, but they don't have an engineering background. Like where do they start, and how do they map out the stakeholders for launching this product?
Okay, so I would start with making the decision of, do you want to make an addition to your team as far as the engineering expertise goes, or do you want to contract an individual and an exterior company to help you do the design? And that's, I would say, dependent upon the available capital. So do you have the money which would allow you to pay somebody else to design something like this and go through that iterative process and the additional cash that's necessary to do that? Or do you have somebody who's close to you who has the necessary expertise to do that, and you can talk them into why you think this is a good idea, why you've bought into it, and the numbers behind that, and why consumers will buy into it, and bring them into the company, and they're able to earn sweat equity. Once that, it becomes very difficult with a hardware product like that, because the cost to do injection molding is astronomical. It's out of my price range. It's out of a lot of people's price range. The molds for a multi-piece product like that could be, $50,000 to $100,000. There are some other resources out there, like Proto Labs, which will allow you to do extremely low production runs, and they own the forms, so you can't send them to somebody else. They're not quite of the highest quality because you can only do short runs with them, but it allows you to get a sense of what you're doing before spending that huge dollar figure to get something akin to a finished product, even if you're not quite ready to get there. I'd also say invest in a 3D printer. 3D printers these days are extremely cheap. Comparatively speaking, you can get one that has high enough quality to effectively prototype this at $200-$300, and that will give you a sense of what does this look like in the flesh? How might it interact as a piece of plastic? You can get yourself educated with the different types of plastic you can be manufacturing out of. So whether that's PLA or ABS or high density polyethylene, all these different things that a designer might ask you down the road, or a manufacturer might ask you down the road. And that's, I would say, probably the first step is find somebody with some engineering expertise, whether the exterior or interior, and then go through the motions of prototyping this beyond cardboard. Cardboard is fantastic, and it's how a lot of modelers go about their first steps. And then there are high quality options for prototyping in plastic, something that gets you 90% of the way to what a finished product would look like with 3D printing. And then that's something that can definitely be given to prospective customers for them to try out. The reliability might not be there. 95% of the functionality might be there, but it gets you an early, very cheap input on how users are going to interact with your product, what it saves them out throughout the day, how much is this really worth to them, and starting to quantify that. And it gives you an idea of, when you do go to that manufacturer or to a high fidelity designer who can put this into design, which the manufacturer knows how to build from, you've got something that you can give them. And you don't necessarily have to go raise additional capital. This is, easily gotten from friends and family if you can pull enough people. And that gets you very far down the road. I think the most difficult part there is definitely finding that team member, though, somebody who does have that engineering expertise. And what might be beneficial is going to a local university. As far as student projects go, you can propose ideas for these. And many times, professors are all ears. They don't want to come up with 10 or 20 different ideas every semester for the kids to solve. And you can get a bunch of ideas very quickly. And these students typically know how to use SolidWorks or Cura or Inventor. And you can get some input for free over 3 months.
Wow, yeah. So I don't want to take for granted like our privilege. Like $300 might be a lot for someone. And they might not have the engineering networks to reach out, right? What might be the title that they can look for? So let's say they're like, I'm going to go to a university and search for, what department should they be looking at? Is it the engineering department, the plastic department?
There's a couple ways you could go with it. And lots of different, it's become the norm now for like capstone design projects. So you could go to a number of different areas where they would be able to do something, and it depends on what you want out of it. So you could go to the design school, art school, where you could get a lot of ideas on what this thing looks like, but not necessarily get something built.
Mm,
Or if you're going to the engineering school, I would go to um, the mechanical engineering department,
mm,
potentially electrical engineering, if there is an electrical component to this. I would be looking for associate or assistant professors who um, are associated with the capstone project. So almost all universities have an online booklet, so to speak, where you can go on and see what courses they're teaching in a particular semester,
mm,
and what they've historically done. So you can go through the booklet, find what number they associate with, and unfortunately, it's different for each university, and contact that particular specifically and professor specifically. And if they're not the right one, I bet you they're willing to forward your email to the right one. Um, there are also some where the students or TAs are the ones who propose the ideas. So TA is probably the best way to get in touch with them is LinkedIn. Find somebody who is a research assistant or a
mm.
PhD candidate at the university in engineering and mechanical engineering. Um, and then typically the university will have the resources necessary to build it. So you don't have to spend any money. The kids can use it for free. You can see what they're doing. And they have
Tinker
the,
Labs. Yeah.
the creator labs that can, all kinds of different materials that are beyond anything you'd need for this, but they have those basic stuff as well. I know in Pittsburgh specifically, I know you're not in Pittsburgh, but there is a nonprofit called Proto Haven, which is a makerspace that is a nonprofit that kind of took the place of Tech Lab or Tech Shop,
Mm,
which did something similar, but Tech Shop did it at a price point which just wasn't tenable for most people. And I believe Proto Haven has opened it up to people. You pay what you're able to pay. And there are a number of organizations in Pittsburgh which do similar things. So I'm sure with a little bit of Googling, you can find something that is available
wow.
for
They
what
have
you're able to give.
a pay what you're able to pay option for their Tinker Space. That's
I
amazing.
do believe so. Yeah, I think they're funded by local foundations.
Yeah.
So really, anything on top of that is just sustainability for them.
Wow. DC has Tinker Labs and libraries, but they are not equipped with some of the more commercial equipment
Okay.
that's required. And if you are watching from New York, I do want to give a shout out to Makerspace NYC, which is run by Scott and DB Lampman, and they were one of our lecturers recently. So you can also check them out. Okay, Jay. So let's now that was an actual question, but now I'm gonna do a little bit of scenario playing. Okay.
Sure.
So let's say this person has their plastic prototype, right? And now they're trying to recruit a technical co-founder that might help them create the mold, the design, the AutoCAD design, or the print design for such a product.
Mhm.
What are the risks of finding a technical co-founder? Is it valid to say, okay, well, I just told someone my $1 million idea and they don't need me, but I need them. So are they going to run away with it? Right? That could be a concern that pops up in
Mhm.
people's heads. Also, I mean, you're going into the relationship with an ask, right? So you haven't really done the due diligence of getting to know this person. Is this someone that has similar values or is compatible? Like, what do
Mhm.
you recommend for that?
Okay. So my first asterisk on all of this is the necessary technical abilities for design for manufacturability get niche very quickly.
Yeah.
So that draws your pool of people down quickly. Unfortunately, so there's a couple ways you could go with this. You could find somebody who already has those abilities, or you could find somebody who could learn those abilities. Finding somebody who already has them, they're most likely going to be older. They're probably going to have a family. They might not be willing to take the risk themselves to do something like this, or the risk that kind of aligns with what they might need to take if they're not being paid or they're only being paid in sweat equity. So my preference personally would be to go to somebody who's younger, somebody who knows AutoCAD, who knows SolidWorks and how to work around those things. Titles for something like that, they are probably like engineer 1, engineer 2, drafter, mechanical specifically. They are probably less than 30. They probably don't have a fully fledged family, so they have additional time to allocate to something like this.
Or better yet, they're retired and looking for a passion project that doesn't pay them.
Sure.
But AutoCAD might be different. I don't know.
There's somebody in Cleveland that we have worked with previously who worked with Disney a long time ago, and now they have their own practice, and that's very similar scenario. So anyways, going back, doing the due diligence, the risks of finding this potential co-founder and bringing them on board, I would say do that due diligence.
I would echo that as someone who's had multiple co-founders.
It's there are a lot of potential references there. With the advent of the internet, there are a lot of ways you can figure out what that person's done, what they might have published in the past, who their employers might have been, who their friends are, what they do on their off time. I mean, just a creepy level of information. And you can get a pretty good picture of the values that somebody might carry, or at least what they like to project. And that's definitely, with Twitter, with Instagram, value signaling and what you aspirationally would like to have versus what you actually have are definitely two different things in the 21st century. So making sure that you dig down into what is this person actually like, it gets a little bit different, and finding those references and finding people who they've worked with in the past to get a better idea, and not necessarily their friends, and that might be more difficult. That's not something I've had to do in the past.
So what's one question you would ask, Jay, to a potential co-founder? Let's say you can only ask one question, they're qualified, but you want to get a sense of...
The best things I have learned about my co-founders is how do they react when things absolutely do not go their way, or the way that we had initially planned for them to go. Who did they end up putting blame on? Was it themselves? Was it another team member? Was it the client? How do they talk about their failures and what they would do differently? So that's probably a pretty long answer for them to give, especially if you have limited time at a networking event or something like that. But that would be what I want to know. And all of that drives down to kind of what we do when we're at the Idea Foundry is we take 2 hours when we're vetting new companies initially, and that's to get a sense of their coachability. If we're going to provide them with all this information, are they going to be able to absorb it and use it appropriately? And it's very analogous to how I would go about, how does somebody deal with failure? How do they pick themselves back up and listen to what the people around them are saying?
Okay. I'm just taking a minute to absorb that. But I know we don't...
Not be the right answer. I'm sure somebody else would give a very different answer, but that's
no. It was a beautiful answer, Jay. That's why I needed the minute to absorb it and cherish it. Anyways, so last scenario, and then I will let you go because I've kept you late. So let's say this person found their co-founder, their technical co-founder. They are ready to go into production. Let's also say that they have been able to create a rough enough prototype that they've launched in Indiegogo. And
Okay.
it's been a success. Now they have
Mm-hmm.
all these purchase orders
Mm-hmm.
for this device.
Yep.
So they're using the purchase orders and that capital to fund the production,
Yep.
right? Let's say they didn't talk to companies before they did that. They just kind of estimated how much it would cost,
Yep.
and they now have to start talking to manufacturers
Yep.
and getting quotes and hoping they don't go over budget so that they don't lose money for soy of
Yep.
someone. So, what is your recommendation for that person? How do you identify the right manufacturer
Mm-hmm.
who sends you the product they promise, right? With the correct specifications,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and does it on time
Yep.
and doesn't give you like the most beautiful demos only to then give you this terrible
Uh,
product.
for that one, it's tricky. So the best answer for finding cheap is unfortunately going offshore, but that doesn't always align with quality. And for quality and making sure that every shipment is up to specification, it's I've found in developing those relationships, spending time with them, and the only way to do that usually is through a local, especially with limited capital, doing it with somebody who's local. Um, Indiegogo. So we did a Kickstarter back in the day. At this point, it was for a 2G development board, and that one we did a little bit reverse. We actually um, had some of the capital up front and we manufactured ahead of time and then our ship lead time was really low. I don't know. But yeah, it becomes very difficult going back out to those potential manufacturers. um, I would ask yourself, does this start a company or was this a product? And making the differentiation between the two. And if it's starting a company and you've got 100 customers on Indiegogo that gave you money. Those are relationships that you want to continue to build. And if you just skate by the skin of your teeth on the manufacturing side of things, it's going to be okay because you have all these potential customers that you can then that will be potentially loyal to you down the road. Who will come back and purchase another product because you spent the time to engineer it correctly. So spending that spending that additional money to get that really high quality product is definitely what you want to do. If you see this as a product and this is um, your lifestyle that they're really talking about, making sure you're putting food on your family, that's what I'm going to prioritize. Food, food on your money, food on your plate for your family. And it's going to become a balance of delivering the highest quality product you can while also maintaining that level of lifestyle, which means that you can live. And those are some hard choices to make. And I definitely appreciate the fact of that. But I would always, always, always put emphasis on the relationships you build with your manufacturers and the due diligence you perform on them.
So, how long does it take to build those relationships?
Oof. So we're actually working with a company right now and doing due diligence on their supply chain. Um, Ultimately, it's less about the amount of time you put into it and more about the number of orders which you are able to commit to them and be able to do the due diligence on what the product looks like when they're coming to you. And if the capital is available to get multiple tests, that's a good way to go. But I would say, at a minimum, I would spend 2 to 3 months in determining what your manufacturer supply chain looks like. Um, and courting all these different manufacturers over those 3 months and speaking with them multiple times over those 3 months to make sure that they're a sustainable business, to make sure that they're going to be able to provide you with that. Educate yourself on the type of machinery that might be necessary. So if you have that technical co-founder, and they're able to read the technical information on what it takes to actually manufacture it, I would definitely do a lot of reading where that is concerned. So that if a manufacturer tells you one thing, you can verify that with your outside resources. Yeah, it's going to be an uphill battle, making that balance between how much capital you want to spend and the outward product. And if you can keep it local is good.
Yeah, especially with the supply chain all out of whack.
Right, with COVID right now, it's more difficult than it needs to be.
Yeah, I think if there was one thing that needed to highlight the importance of having the capacity to build local, right? It's probably COVID. Awesome. I could ask you so many more questions, but we've gone over, and I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate your work you're doing. I appreciate your expertise, and thank you for being here with us today. So I will end the broadcast and stay on so we can debrief.
Perfect.
That was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the platform very much.
You appreciate the what? I'm sorry?
The platform, the ability to speak with your audience.
It's of course. I think we're still live, by the way.
Oh, either way.
Ending. But that's okay. We're not saying anything. Go ahead. So it's